I remember the sound of the front door slamming behind me, a hollow echo that signaled the final time I would step out of my childhood home as a resident. My parents had looked me in the eyes. The reason was as straightforward as it was. They needed my bedroom for my pregnant sister. The arrangement in their heads was that her coming baby required space, and the easiest solution was to tell me I had 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live. I was 22, working 2 part-time jobs, and I had nowhere to go but my car. I didn't bother arguing. My parents had been crystal clear that my presence was not a priority. My sister, Janine, had just turned 17 and gotten pregnant by her high school boyfriend. Rather than question her choices or encourage her to take responsibility, my parents decided I was the disposable one. Standing on the driveway with a trash bag of clothes, I felt like I'd been replaced. My car, a dented old Toyota, was about to become my new home. If I stayed in town at all, it was only because I had to keep working to afford at least some scraps of independence. I had been saving money for community college, but that dream evaporated overnight. My meager wages from the local grocery store and the diner downtown went toward gas, insurance, and a gym membership so I could shower in the mornings. I'd park in side streets or sometimes behind the diner, hoping no one would notice me curled up in the back seat. Pride kept me from asking friends for a place to crash. My parents, after all, had decided I was unnecessary, so I forced myself to adapt, to push forward one day at a time, determined not to let despair swallow me whole. Sometimes, in the dark hours of the night, I felt a gnawing anger toward my parents. I wondered if they had any sense of guilt or if they slept easily knowing their child was out there in a parking lot, huddling under a thin blanket. The anger flickered, though. Mostly, I struggled with a deep sadness that I'd been cast aside so easily. My sister had always been the family's golden girl, but I never expected my parents would literally evict me for her sake. Yet, in a twisted way, it fueled something in me. A small, fierce determination to survive. For the first 6 months, I lived in that Toyota, making ends meet. I'd fold my clothes and keep them in the trunk, wash myself at the gym, and eat leftover diner food when the boss turned a blind eye. I learned to function on minimal sleep, tired but never willing to let exhaustion get the best of me. Meanwhile, Janine's pregnancy progressed, and my parents told the world how they were to become grandparents. I caught glimpses of them sometimes in town, smiling, shopping for baby clothes, or boasting about the nursery they'd set up in my old room. I avoided them like the plague, but sometimes I just couldn't help overhearing their enthusiastic gossip. At work, customers who recognized me would ask about my sister, clueless to my situation. I'd nod politely, muster a strained smile, and say I was happy for her. Inside, my resentment grew, coiling tight in my gut. But I didn't want pity. I wanted self-reliance. I wanted to carve out a future for myself that no one could strip away. So, I pinched every penny and slept in that cramped car, refusing to let my parents' betrayal define the rest of my life. One day, I met an older gentleman at the diner who left me a generous tip. He noticed I was wearing the same uniform I wore at the grocery store and asked if I ever slept. I dodged the question, but he pressed. Something about him radiated concern. After a conversation, he offered me a room in the rental property he owned on the outskirts of town. The rent was cheap if I'd agree to help with minor maintenance. I took a leap and accepted, handing him the bills I'd saved. That night, I slept in a bed. Having a roof, even a modest one, changed everything. I could cook simple meals, I could sleep without fear of someone knocking on my window, and, most importantly, I could focus on forging a better future. My new landlord, Mr. Hendricks, was patient and kind. He taught me basic plumbing and let me paint the walls however I liked. With my living situation stable, I managed to pick up more hours at the diner, eventually becoming a full-time employee. I started setting aside money again, slowly building a nest egg. The shame I'd carried began to fade, replaced by a quiet resolve. Whenever I spotted my sister or parents around town, I pretended not to see them. Sometimes they'd notice me and wave, but I never approached. I had nothing to say to them. It wasn't until Janine gave birth to a baby girl that my parents made any attempt to contact me. Mom called the diner, leaving a message that she wanted me to come meet my niece. I deleted it without responding. The memory of sleeping in my car was still fresh, and I would not give them the satisfaction of acting like nothing had happened. Their betrayal was unforgettable. Years blurred past, each step forward. I earned a scholarship to a local trade program, studying culinary arts while working at the diner. My hustle paid off, and eventually I landed a job at a restaurant an hour away. The commute was tough, but the pay was good, and I thrived there. Over time, I climbed the ranks, from line cook to sous chef, building a reputation. While I built my new life, Janine married her boyfriend, and my parents celebrated the birth of her second child. I heard about these things only through passing comments, never from them directly. With each promotion, I saved more. I also started a small catering business on the side. Even after paying for a decent apartment, I was able to put money aside for investments. Mr. Hendricks had inspired me, and I eventually bought a duplex, living in one half and renting out the other. My nights became a whirlwind of cooking, planning menus, and dreaming bigger. I was proud of how far I had come, proud that I had proven I was more than an unwanted body occupying precious square footage in my parents' house. I was building a life on my own terms. One late afternoon, I saw my father at the grocery store. He was rummaging through discounted meat, a shopping cart filled with cheap cereal and diapers. Without thinking, I ducked behind a display of canned tomatoes, my heart pounding. I hadn't spoken to him in over 5 years. My father looked tired, older, with streaks of gray in his hair that hadn't been there before. In that split second, I had a choice: approach him or remain hidden. I chose to hide. My resentment toward him was so strong that I couldn't stomach the idea of exchanging meaningless pleasantries. A week later, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I answered warily. It was my mother. Her voice sounded tight, as if she were speaking through clenched teeth. She said they missed me, that the family needed to stick together. I almost laughed out loud, but a flicker of curiosity made me ask why she was calling now. That's when she confessed Janine was struggling, raising 4 kids on a limited income. My parents were also strapped for cash. They'd taken out a second mortgage to help Janine, and now bills were piling up. I listened, silent and cold. She asked if I could spare some money, maybe a few thousand, to help them keep the lights on. The gall of it floored me. Had she forgotten how they kicked me out? Did she assume I harbored no grudge? While she rambled about how family should look out for each other, I pictured that day I'd driven away from my childhood home in tears. I felt no pity for them. I remained calm, letting her finish her plea, her voice quivering in desperation. When she finally paused, I told her I'd think about it and hung up. I sat in my living room, staring at the phone in disbelief. They needed me now, after all this time. They tossed me out like garbage, but suddenly, I was family again because I had something they wanted. The bitterness choked me, threatening to resurface all the old wounds I'd tried so hard to bury. I decided I wouldn't respond in anger or haste. Instead, I took a walk, cleared my head, and relived the moments that shaped me, the nights in my car, the humiliating pity stares, the ache of exclusion. In that clarity, my anger became something sharper, more purposeful. For days, I deliberated, remembering how it felt to be alone and scared. The cruelty of my parents was real and unearned, but so was the idea that I was a better person than they'd ever been to me. Was I obligated to help them now that I'd achieved some success? People said forgiveness was noble, but was forgiveness even possible when the betrayal was so fundamental? In the end, I decided I couldn't let them off the hook so easily. They made their choice years ago, and now it was time for me to make mine. So, I returned my mother's call. I told her I was open to discussing their financial predicament, but only in person. She quickly agreed, sounding almost relieved. We arranged to meet at a small cafe near my hometown. The place was neutral territory, a bland little spot where nobody knew me anymore. I arrived early, sipping coffee, my heart galloping in my chest. Then they walked in, my mother and father, looking as if the weight of the world was on their shoulders. They tried to smile at me, but I could see the desperation etched across their faces. Settling into a booth, they launched into their story. Janine now had 4 children, a part-time job, and a husband who'd recently been laid off. My parents had sunk their savings into helping her, but it wasn't enough. Their mortgage payments were behind, and they feared losing the house. My father's health was failing, and my mother's hours had been cut. Through it all, they kept saying they didn't know where else to turn, that family should help family. I listened silently, letting them spill their woes as if I were some benevolent savior who owed them unconditional support. They finished with a plea for help. My mother's eyes glistened, and my father looked away, refusing to meet my gaze. I inhaled, recalling every moment I'd endured. The nights in my car, the hunger in my gut, the pride. My heart pounded, but I kept my face controlled. They had no idea how far I'd come, and they had never bothered to find out. I let the silence stretch, relishing their discomfort, before I spoke in a measured tone. "I remember how you helped me when I needed a place to stay," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. My father flinched, and my mother started to sob. They tried to offer explanations, something about being overwhelmed by Janine's pregnancy, about doing what they thought was best. I refused to accept it. Best for them, maybe, but not for me. They'd left me homeless, never checked if I was surviving, never offered a hand when I was struggling. My father finally muttered an apology. It fell flat, sounding more like regret for their current predicament than remorse for past actions. I told them I felt no obligation to bail them out, that maybe Janine's decisions were catching up with everyone. My mother begged, reminding me that Janine's kids were innocent, that they shouldn't suffer. She asked if I would at least think of the children, if not her or my father. I stared at her tear-streaked face, recalling how I'd once wished for a fraction of this concern when I was out on the street. I told her that the children were Janine's responsibility, and, by extension, my parents if they chose to support her. I wouldn't punish the kids, but I wasn't about to take on the burden forced upon me. They created this mess, and they had to handle it. As we spoke, their desperation sharpened. My father asked if there was any possible arrangement, perhaps a loan, something they could pay back over time. He admitted they had poor credit, but insisted he'd find a way to reimburse me. I let him talk, scrutinizing every line of his weary face. He was aging, and for a moment, I felt the tug of compassion. But then I remembered the pit in my stomach the day they told me I had to leave. I remembered how they locked the door behind me. Compassion fizzled, replaced by an icy sense of justice. I said I'd consider a loan if they signed a legally binding contract, one that required collateral. My mother looked confused. My father frowned, asking what I meant. I explained I'd only lend them money if they put their house on the line as security. If they defaulted, the house would be mine. Their faces drained of color. My mother muttered, "You'd take our home?" I replied that I was only asking for the same mercy they showed me. They had taught me a lesson that day. Survival was a ruthless game, and I had learned to play. They balked at my terms, but I was unwavering. My father's voice shook with anger, accusing me of being heartless. I reminded him that he'd been heartless first. My mother sobbed again, but I'd expected that. My offer was simple, a short-term loan to cover their overdue bills. If they paid it back on time, great. If not, I'd own the property. No more illusions about unconditional support. Their tears didn't move me anymore. I was no longer the frightened young man forced onto the street. I was someone with power, and I was wielding it without remorse. In the end, they slumped in defeat. My father muttered that they'd think about it. I told them to call me when they were ready to sign. The ball was in their court. As I watched them leave, shoulders hunched in despair, I felt a curious mix of triumph and sadness. This was what they'd made me. I wasn't evil, but I wasn't their doormat anymore either. I knew Janine's children were innocent, but Janine herself had never shown me mercy. She'd taken my room without a second thought. My parents had let it all happen. Now they wanted my sympathy. A week later, my father called. They'd spoken with a lawyer, he said, and they were prepared to sign the contract. They had no other options. I listened with a detached calm. We set a date to finalize the documents, meeting at a small law office where I paid for a notary. My parents looked broken, but resolute. I had no illusions that this was a happy reunion. It was a business deal, plain and simple. They needed money, and I was providing it, under harsh conditions. This was the only arrangement under which I'd ever consider parting with a single dime. After signing, I handed them a check. My mother cried quietly. My father mumbled a subdued thank you. Then they left, and I felt an overwhelming wave of relief. I owed them nothing else. If they managed to pay me back, fine. If not, the house they'd chosen over me would become mine. Part of me hoped they'd pay it back on time because I wasn't sure how I'd feel owning the property where I'd grown up, the place that still haunted me with memories of being cast aside. But the other part of me almost wanted them to fail. Time crawled by. Months passed. They made partial payments, often late, always with some excuse about Janine's kids or unexpected bills. I sent polite reminders, but in truth, I was indifferent. If they defaulted, I won. If they succeeded, I lost nothing but gained nothing either. Eventually, the day of reckoning arrived. They missed their final payment, and the grace period elapsed. I gave them one last warning. When they still couldn't pay, I exercised my legal right to claim the house. The keys were handed over to me. My parents moved in with Janine, their faces hollow with defeat. Standing in that empty home, I wandered through the corridors, each room echoing with ghosts of my childhood. I opened the door to what used to be my bedroom. It had been redecorated for Janine's kids, pastel walls and cartoon stickers. The air smelled stale, and the silence weighed heavily. I didn't want to live there. The memories were too raw. Instead, I decided to renovate, flip the property, and sell it. The profits would be mine, a final testament to the twisted legacy my parents had left behind. This house had symbolized rejection, but now it symbolized victory. I never heard from them again. Maybe they were too ashamed, or perhaps they figured I was beyond their reach now. Either way, I'd found closure. I was no longer the lost young adult banished to a dented Toyota. I was a successful chef, a property owner, a survivor, and if they ever asked for forgiveness, they would find none. I'd given them a chance to show me the compassion they'd once denied, and they couldn't meet the terms. In the end, all they taught me was that sometimes revenge is the only closure that rings true.